So we read about half of the passage that we're covering this morning, really chapters 10 through 12. And I want to start with a phrase that you've probably heard before. The phrase is simple. Never again. Never again. Right? It's the phrase that we use every time, anytime there's any kind of tragedy. When there's grief and when there's pain, we say, never again. And what we mean is that we are willing to do whatever it takes to make sure that something will never happen again. And I want us to be thinking about this. Maybe consider the last time you heard somebody say, never again. This will never happen again. How do we go about making sure that bad things will never happen again? Our approach is pretty straightforward, our typical approach, at least as like a culture or society. We're really good at looking what happened and saying, I don't like that, I don't want it to happen again. And then we quickly move to say, who is at fault? And so we find someone to blame. And then we try to change their behavior, or we try to protect ourselves from their behavior. And so we make sure that bad things never happen again by doing our best to make sure that other people don't do bad things to us. The book of Chronicles was written for a group of people who had endured devastating tragedy. It was written to the southern kingdom of Israel, the group of people we call Judah. And they had been brutalized by a conquering enemy. The people had lost everything, right? They lost their land, they lost their country, they lost their familiar religious practices, and they had been dragged into a kind of exile, physically moved across the world to start new lives in a weird and a foreign land that they did not choose for themselves. But they've survived miraculously. And at this point, when Chronicles is being written, more than 100 years have passed and they've returned to the land. There's like glimmers of hope. They are rebuilding lives for themselves, and they want to make sure that the terrible things that happened in the past never happen again. But the temptation, right, is to blame others. They want to blame the northern kingdom of Israel, right? I said that these are the southerners, Judah. They want to blame their northern neighbors, like actual siblings. You could hear the southern kingdom pointing its finger, whining to dad, saying, they started it, right? When they aren't blaming their brother, they're blaming the neighbor kids. They want to blame the neighborhood bullies, neighbors like Egypt who were constantly attacking them. Right? They did it to us. That's why everything went bad for us. The people, they're tempted to point the finger, to find someone to blame. So then, they can make plans to ensure that they, right, those people, never hurt us again. And this seems to be one of like the most human instincts we have, which is why Jesus, in the Sermon on the Mount, names this when he questions whether we should be trying to take the speck out of our neighbor's eye when our eye might have a larger plank in it. Here's one of the major ideas at work in Chronicles. When we start by finding blame in others, we almost always learn the wrong lessons from our past. And so think about this. Try to enter into their experience. You are the people of Judah, and you're returning to your land after years in exile in a foreign land. And you remember that all the terrible things you've endured happened because you were conquered by an invading army. So you arrive back at your old home, and you've rebuilt a house for yourself, and you've replanted your fields to provide for yourself. You have restarted life. What else would be on your priority list of things to do next? Well, for these people, Judeans returning, it was build our defenses back up, fortify our cities, right? To make sure that we are never conquered again. Never again. Right? You look to the potential conqueror, and you do your best to defend yourself against that potential attack. This is where Chronicles has something to say. If you have your Bibles, you can open to 2 Chronicles 11:5. It'll be up on the screen as well. But Rehoboam lived in Jerusalem, and he built cities for defense in Judah. He built fortified cities that are in Judah and in Benjamin. He made the fortresses strong, and he put commanders in them. And he put shields and spears in all the cities and made them very strong. So he held Judah and Benjamin. Chronicles is retelling the story of these people who've come back to the land to these people, right? And he's asking the question. He's like, remember when your first king built cities for defense? Do you remember when he fortified those cities? And remember when he made them strong? And then do you remember just how strong they were? He kind of leaves it hanging there. And then Chronicles immediately shifts directions to tell a very different story about strength. How different is this story? Chapter 11, verse 13, we read, the priests and the Levites who were in all Israel presented themselves to Rehoboam, the king. And those who had set their hearts to seek Yahweh, God of Israel, came after them from all the tribes of Israel to Jerusalem to sacrifice to Yahweh, the God of their fathers. They strengthened the kingdom of Judah. And for 3 years, they made Rehoboam, the son of Solomon, secure. For they walked for 3 years in the way of David and Solomon. Can you hear the parallels between these two stories? Right? One story is strength built around military commanders with their shields and their spears and their fortifications. And the other story is strength built around priests and Levites and people who are seeking God and making sacrifices to him. Chronicles is calling out to its audience. An audience that is tempted to rebuild its defenses to protect itself. An audience that is tempted to gather weapons and fortify itself against its enemies. To these people, Chronicles asks, do you remember when the priests led the people to seek God? Do you remember when the people brought their sacrifices to God? Do you remember how this strengthened the kingdom? Do you remember how secure you were? Chronicles presents two stories side by side of strength and security. Lays out two national priorities, right? National defense and faithful worship. A superficial reading would read these stories side by side and conclude that this is the program. This is how you successfully secure a nation, right? Build a strong national defense and seek God rightly. Do both of them and you will be blessed. The problem with this reading is in the details and in the story that follows, because notice first that the priests and people, they only seek God for 3 years. Chronicles tells us that the kingdom was secure for 3 years. Even though the kingdom had a strong national defense, there are deep cracks in its security. And in chapter 12, we actually see it all crumble. Chapter 12, verse 1, we read, when the rule of Rehoboam was established and he was strong. In the 5th year, it comes after 3, Shishak, king of Egypt, came up against Jerusalem, and he took the fortified cities. He took away the treasures of the house of Yahweh and the treasures of the king's house. He took away everything. Looks like all their building was for nothing. This is the very beginning of the southern kingdom of Jerusalem, but it actually sounds exactly like the end of the kingdom. Replace the names and the empires, replace Shishak of Egypt with Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon, and it's the same story. Babylon came up against Jerusalem. Nebuchadnezzar took away the fortified cities. He took the treasures of the house of the Lord. Nebuchadnezzar took away everything. So the people have relived their story multiple times. And it poses this question, well, what did the first generation of Judeans and the last generation of the southern kingdom, what did both of them have in common? Well, one of the obvious details as you read the story is that they both felt secure because of their strong national defense. They had lots of fortifications. They had lots of weapons. They had all kinds of strength. And in both cases, none of these things made any difference. Their strength failed them. But the first and the last generation had something else in common as well. Neither generation sought God. They did not worship God. They did not trust their God. They trusted in their own strength. And so when we read that the rule of Rehoboam was established and he was strong, we realize that the author is messing with us, right? The ancient Judeans don't have punctuation, and I can't imagine they used air quotes. It feels fairly contemporary, but can you hear the author saying the rule of Rehoboam was established and he was strong? Right? Like, this is a huge part of Chronicles' message. Hey, you coming back to the land, listen, you're going to be tempted to see exile as a failure of your national defense. You're going to be tempted to think that if you had only had higher walls and bigger chariots and more chariots, you would have survived. False. That is not true. Instead, Chronicles is announcing that you have a long history, a long story of repeatedly turning to your national defense to save you when you should have been turning to God. So, coming back to Judah's two national priorities, national defense and faithful worship, we're reminded that if and when the people turned to God, if and when they listened to God's instructions, they would have remembered that God said national defense was never to be one of their priorities. Because if they would seek God, if they would obey him, he promised to take care of their defense for them. And so as you read the story of Israel, you discover that Israel's problem was actually never with their neighbors. It was never their neighbors. If they had a problem with their neighbors, we're told the problem was actually always with their relationship with God. And Chronicles names this relationship issue exactly. I've got 3 verses here straight from this passage, right? Rehoboam abandoned the law of Yahweh, and all Israel abandoned with him. Thus says Yahweh, you abandoned me, so I have abandoned you to the hand of Shishak. What a great name. Rehoboam did evil, for he did not set his heart to seek Yahweh. The people are tempted. The people coming back to the land tempted to see the speck in their neighbor's eyes, to blame them and see them as the threat. But Chronicles is giving them eyes to see the plank in their own eyes, which gives us the chance, which is really an invitation to us to consider the planks that might be in our own eyes when we're tempted to blame others for the things that are happening in our lives. We are tempted to look around. We're tempted to see our neighbors, to see our enemies, and to blame them for whatever, for anything, for everything. It's really easy to say, like, well, I can't do X because of fill in the blank, because these people, because our culture, because blah, blah, blah. But like this passage challenges us to look at our own priorities, the church's priorities, our family priorities. And here's just some questions that it challenges us, might challenge us to consider. Like, where are we in our lives taking our cues from the culture? Like, where are we trying to help our kids compete in the world? Where are we pursuing the goals of our neighbors? Where are we working hard to give our kids the tools to thrive according to the values of society? There are other kinds of questions that we could ask. I think these kinds of priorities might be the equivalent of Judah's national defense strategy. Because in so many ways, we spend so much of our time and our energy on these kinds of things. We spend our time competing with our neighbors. And this means that we often put our trust in the things that will give us the advantage, that will give us the edge, help us win, help us be successful. And this can often come to the neglect of the most important thing. And so our passage, it poses some questions for us about like the most important thing that might help us consider like what is our relationship with the most important thing. And so a different set of questions might be, how often do we present ourselves to Jesus to serve him as his priests? How often do we just come before him and say, I'm ready to do your will and your work? How fully do our hearts belong to God? When and where do we seek Yahweh, the God of Israel? What are we willing to sacrifice to the God of our parents? As it did for the first audience, the story of Rehoboam and his reign, it challenges us. Are we willing to see the truth about ourselves, whatever that might be? Are we concerned enough about our relationship with God, knowing that our relationship with God is our only true source of security in the world? Or are we far too concerned with our own efforts to build a safe, secure, comfortable life for ourselves and our families? I think this is one of the planks that our passage presents to us. But there's another major one, and this one I'll run through quickly. It's found in the story that we heard read a little bit ago by Alex and Lauren. Jeroboam and Rehoboam, the north and the south, sibling rivalry, a divided people. If you are the southern kingdom and everything seemed fine during David and Solomon, then it would be really easy to look at your siblings in the north, to look at their revolt, those who followed Jeroboam, to look at their active disunity and to blame them for everything that came after, right? Hey, we were one people. We were fine until they broke apart a good thing. They started it. Maybe you know somebody like this in your life. If you don't know somebody, maybe you are the person. I don't know. Someone did something to them at one moment in their life. And since that moment, every bad thing that has happened has been the fault of that other person. Just listen around this week. Maybe listen to the news, not for too long, just for a minute. It won't take you long to hear it. But listen to people complain. You'll hear it everywhere. On Thursday, I was on a middle school campus here in Livermore where I accidentally walked right into a fight that was starting, and as I broke it up, both kids immediately pointed to the other one and said, "He started it." Republicans and Democrats, just listen and you will hear every complaint followed by some sort of, "They started it." Matters of life and death, war, Israel and Palestine, listen, and you'll hear everyone on every side screaming, "They started it." Here's what Chronicles thinks about that. The split between North and South. It started with Solomon's mistreatment of all of his citizens. And Rehoboam was given a chance to acknowledge the sins of his father and to repent, to walk a different direction. But Rehoboam refused. In fact, confronted with his own family's sin, he doubled down. He deliberately decided to sin against his own people, the people that were entrusted into his care through his treatment of them. So then, the northern kingdom breaks away and follows Jeroboam instead. And Chronicles does something so interesting because we read this in chapter 10, verse 16. It says, when all Israel say that the king did not listen to them, it says all Israel went to their tents. Well, this is actually a reference. It was the northern kingdom. So the northern kingdom of Israel, they go to their tents. But then we read in 10:17, Rehoboam reigned over the people of Israel who lived in the cities of Judah. And you realize, wait, Israel is also now describing the southern kingdom. This tells us that the southern kingdom are called Israel. And then finally, verse 19 tells us everything. It says, so Israel has been in rebellion against the house of David to this day. So fascinating, because if Judah is tempted to point the finger at the northern kingdom of Israel, Chronicles won't let them, because Judah is also Israel. And they have been in rebellion against the house of David since that moment up to the present day when Chronicles was written. Rehoboam is in rebellion against the house of David when he mistreats David's citizens. Rehoboam, the southern king, is in rebellion against the house of David when his solution is to put together an army and try to fight the northern kingdom. Rehoboam is in rebellion when he builds defenses and when he doesn't seek God, and on and on. The only way Judah will walk a new path is if and when they can see their own sins against their God. When they can see their own rebellion against God's heart and God's will. But as we know from the story that unfolds, it's not going to happen yet. Not yet. When? We're told that what the people need is a new heart. They don't have a heart that seeks God, but that is what they need. When does it come? How do they receive this new heart? The biblical story tells us that it is when we see God in the flesh. When Jesus arrives in the flesh, in the person of Jesus, and he shows us his kindness, that while we were still sinners, Jesus dies for us. That something happens when we see our God do this. We see the kind of heart we were made for. We see what God is willing to do for us. And we're told that it is at that place where something changes in humanity, where we want that new heart, and where God gives it to us, and a new path is possible. It's when we see Jesus suffering for us and for our sins. When we see Jesus laying down his life for his enemies, that we see and we are transformed. We're going to come to the table this morning to remember and to give thanks for what God did, knowing that this new heart makes it possible for us to stop blaming others, but in humility, let God show us who we are and who he made us to be.